that could be considered great stories of the Bible that we're just going to bypass. And as I look, because there's no way you can do justice to this unless you set out from the beginning saying that we're going to do this for a couple of years, because doing it only one night a week for X number of weeks of the year, and that doesn't include all the 52 weeks of the year, means that you're just not gonna get them. And I've been praying about which ones to lift up the most, and so I realize that I'm going to miss some, and I probably am just going to mangle the selection over the course of this time. But what I'm trying to do right now, at least, is to try to make sure that we hit on what would be the critically important stories, but also those that tie into the story of Jesus. Because the Old Testament, and here's something you can remember this, I think it was St. Augustine who said this, the Old Testament points to the New, while the New Testament interprets the Old. So all that means that it relates to Jesus. And I'll tell you this just as a sad commentary on the state of where the church is, but one of our seminaries, Candler, which is attached to Emory in Atlanta, several years ago told their Master of Divinity students, their clergy students, that they were banned from making any reference to Jesus using an Old Testament passage, and if they were doing an Old Testament class, they were banned from pointing anything, reading Jesus into anything. I don't know why.
Does that mean they just throw the book out?
Do what?
Just throw the book out?
Throw the book out, basically. Yeah. I mean, basically it was just apparently this is standalone stuff that has nothing to do with anything else, which is ridiculous, of course. But we turn this down and get started. So we start tonight with this story of Joseph, and the overarching thing that Joseph plays into God's promise. Joseph is sort of the conduit or continuum of God's promise. So if you remember, we hit the highlights of God's promise. That it began in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, when he promised to send a Savior to undo the curse that took place after Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit. And then you had a type of Christ, a representation of Christ in the person of Noah, who, even as Peter goes on to say in the New Testament, who saved humanity, in a sense, by building that ark, and his wife and sons, 3 sons and 3 daughters-in-law were on there, and through them, the rest of humanity came. And then, of course, you have Abraham, and again that promise that through him all the nations of the world would be blessed. So now we come to how that blessing works itself out. But I want to point out something to you first. Abraham is revered as the father of 3 separate faiths, and we've discussed that. The Muslims, the Jews, and the Christians refer to him as Father Abraham. He is the great patriarch. And while he may be the father of many faiths and many nations and things like that, he was a lousy father. And and this is important. He really was an abject failure as a father, and he passed this trait down to his sons. This is an interesting sociological observation because we see that in the children, the grown children of broken homes, the grown children of abusive parents, especially fathers, they continue that trait. They continue that brokenness, they continue that abuse, they continue that incompetence, inability to be good fathers. This is important because this family disunity continues all down through. I mean, just read Abraham. You got Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but you got all these other conflicting stories. You got Ishmael, you got Esau, you got all this other stuff, and there's duplicity, there's animosity, there's disunity, almost any negative thing you can find. There's deception, just out and out lying. I like the word mendacity. That's one that goes along with it. But you got all of these things, and so this family line. Now get this: this family line through which humanity is going to be saved is totally dysfunctional. Absolutely dysfunctional. We get down to Jacob, and you remember the story of Jacob. Jacob had, there was that trick with his, who was going to be his wife, and when he got tricked and all that. He had, how many did he have? He had 10 children by Leah, but the one he really wanted was Rachel. Rachel was his favorite. Now, I'm not going to comment on the problem of having more than one wife. That's just that's a topic for another day. But there's a problem you see here even in that. Jacob plays favorites. So he plays favorites with Rachel. And Rachel ends up having, who are we talking about? Joseph. And I'm not very clear-headed for some reason. I think it's this lack of chew food is just getting to my brain. So she has Joseph, and then of course she has Benjamin on the way back home. She dies in the process. We're going to talk about that if we have time at the end. So that's the 12 sons. So you have the 12 sons, the 12 tribes there. But then we go down to these sons. Joseph is the firstborn son of the favorite, Rachel. Joseph becomes the favorite of 12 sons. It's a setup for failure, and we're gonna see that in just a minute. Let me just set something aside for a minute and talk to you just about sort of dating the time of Joseph. Joseph lived at the time when and this makes it a historical connection. I just want to give you this so that you can historically pinpoint when either Amenhotep the first or Thutmose, or Thutmose, as some might say, the first, were the pharaohs of Egypt. So this puts it in the historical line. Now there's a reason that we are of that opinion, and it's hard. Again, it's hard to pinpoint these dates, but there's a lot of things in there. One is that there were certain Egyptian pharaohs who changed the names of foreigners and gave them Egyptian names. And these two were the two who were alive during that time frame who did that. And they actually gave him the Egyptian name Zapnath Paneah, which really is a Egyptian way of saying he who is called Joseph. But it's not he who is called Joseph in Hebrew, it's he who is called Joseph in Egyptian. So it's an interesting thing. He's given a wife also who is a priest of On. The Greek city where this was located, the Greek name for the city is called Heliopolis. And so this is kind of important because the main god that they worshiped was Thoth, the equivalent of Baal, and On was a lesser god, and Thutmose and Amenhotep also had the habit of rewarding their special people with cities or with places to live. And since On was a lesser god, that's what they did. So anyway, so you can date Joseph. And I think that's important because people need to realize that Joseph, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, none of these people are made up. They're not mythological characters. You can't date Hercules, for instance. You can't set a time period parameter around Mercury or Venus. Not the planets, but the gods. But you can do that for biblical figures because they were real. So let's go to the story of Joseph being sold as a slave. So here's part of the problem that we have. It's a setup from the beginning. The brothers were angry at Joseph because he was Daddy's favorite. There was a lot of animosity that existed there. This is found in chapter 39. And let me just read a little bit of this. Genesis chapter 39. Joseph had been brought down, wait a minute. 37. I can't read it either. Thank you. Before that, there's another thing that's happened. So Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojourning, the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph was 17 years old, pasturing his flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he was the son of his old age. He made him a robe of many colors. I'll talk about that in a minute. But when his brothers saw their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Family dysfunction. Now Joseph had a dream. When he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." And his brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and his words. He dreamed another dream, told to his brothers, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow down ourselves on the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous, but his father kept it saying in mind. So you got several problems going on here. You've got got 10 older brothers who finally, after 17 years, come to realize that the next to last kid is the favorite, is daddy's favorite. So they don't like him. He's really technically a half-brother to them anyway. And so they really don't have a great connection with him. So you got this animosity. Then Joseph has dreams. The Bible doesn't tell us about the morality of whether or not what he did was good or bad, but we just know by the outcome that this was one of those things you could have looked at and said, I don't believe I'd have said that. So, in other words, he had dreams. His dreams directly affected his relationship with his brothers. And it might have been something he'd been better off keeping to himself, because it came across as bragging. It came across as a little, we might say today, a punk kid trying to get back at his older brothers and saying, look, jacklegs, you're going to treat me this way, you're going to hate me, because daddy likes me more than you. Wasn't that an old Smothers Brothers thing? Mother always did love me more than you, or something like that. And so I'm going to tell you what I dreamed. I dreamed, and all that business about sheaves is just, analogy. I dreamed that you all are going to bow down to me. Not only that, I dreamed that the sun and the moon, daddy and mama, and you are going to, and now mama's long since dead, but still he throws it out there that the whole of his family will bow down to him. Now, it's prophetic because it will happen. But we also know by how Moses worded the sentences that followed that it didn't help soothe the family relationship. In fact, it only incited it more. So they hated him. It says they hated him all the more. So what's the next thing they did? His brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel, that's Jacob, said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them." And he said to him, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." So he went. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the field. The man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I'm seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where they're pasturing the flock." And the man said, "They have gone away, for I've heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" That's Canaan land, not Alabama. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. And they saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer." Let me pause for a minute. So Joseph didn't help matters by wearing this coat that his daddy made him. Now, I am a great fan of the Dolly Parton song, "Coat of Many Colors." But the "Coat of Many Colors" in Dolly Parton's song, while it's a top 10 country music song of all time, in my opinion, is nothing like the "Coat of Many Colors" here. Because if you remember the Dolly Parton song, Mama had a box of rags, and she sewed them all together, different colored rags. She sewed them all together, and she told the story of Joseph in the Bible as she sewed them and put together. And so she was very proud of this thing. It's a beautiful sentiment in the story. But this is more like the Broadway play Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, because this thing is some kind of fancy. Actually, the word means, it means palm length, so it's something like this. It's about this far down. It's a cloak and not a coat, so you get the idea of a Batman cape. And so it's that, but it means in Hebrew to be made of fine wool and silk, striped and embroidered. So essentially, again, it's a prophecy in itself, the coat is, because the coat is reminiscent of royalty. of someone in high authority. I imagine that Jacob had help with it, because I doubt that he was a good embroiderer. But to have silk in that area would have been, now the silk, what's it called? The Silk Highway?
Silk Road.
Silk Road, thank you. The Silk Road from China is already in existence at this point. So they would have had silk from China, and that sort of thing. Wool they had, but the silk they would have gotten from somewhere else, but they got it. It's a great thing. So they're putting it on, he gives him this. It also, a person who would wear such a thing, and this is in Hebrew customs, the Talmud speaks of this, a person who would wear such a thing as this would be considered somebody who's above everybody else, that they didn't really work. Kind of like
My boss's son.
a boss's son. Yeah, I was gonna say, like people say that about pastors, or coaches. We only work one day a week. That sort of thing. But yeah, somebody who's detached from the real world. So the coat was a gift. It's also a prophecy, but it's also the straw that broke the camel's back, because the next thing it says, let's kill it. Come now, verse 20, let us kill him and throw him into one of these pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of him. Now, Reuben is a good one in the bunch. Reuben heard it and rescued him out of their hands, saying, let's not take his life. He said, let's shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors he wore. They took him and they threw him in the pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. Looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites. These are cousins. Coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing gum, not chewing gum, balm and myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother in our own flesh. And his brothers listened. And the Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit, and they sold him for 20 shekels of silver. Keep that in your head. They took Joseph to Egypt. They saw that Joseph was not in the pit. He tore his clothes, returned to his brothers, and said, the boy's gone, and I, where shall I go? They took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in blood, remember that, and they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, this we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not. See, they didn't even say whether it's our brother's. This is their dysfunction. I used to have a habit of doing that to, if Mama would call me and she'd be frustrated at my brother or my sister, and I would refer to them as, well, it's your son or your daughter, like that. And I'm just playing, but we do that sometimes. And it's a way of putting distance between there. Jacob tore up his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. And meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him to Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. So, this is important. So, they sell him off. And the dating of the Hebrew people in slavery is important, because the Bible indicates that the date that they were enslaved, it's rounded in some places to 400, and it's given definitively in other places as 430. Now the problem with that is that they were not actually in Egypt for 430 years. So where does this? This kind of an aside. I want you to know this because, in case anybody comes up and says, "Well, the Bible is inaccurate because it says that they were not." You know, when you get down to the story of Moses and see how long they were in Egypt, they weren't in there 400 years. Well, what the Bible actually says about the people of God being enslaved or what have you is that they will be in the lands of foreign gods. They will not be in their own land. They will not be among their people and that sort of thing for 430 years. So the dating, the Septuagint version of the Bible is the Greek version of the Old Testament. It's the one Jesus used, and it's the one the New Testament writers used. It actually helps us understand why, because it dates, it includes in that 400 years the beginning of Abraham's wandering out of Ur of the Chaldees and all around down in there. He doesn't possess Canaan. He doesn't possess the Promised Land or anything like that. And so from Abraham, Isaac, to Jacob, to Joseph, to these people being in Egypt for Moses to come get at some point, it's 430 years. So the Bible is accurate. It's just, you have to understand when the dates begin. So he's sold into slavery. Next we come to who he sold to. He sold to a guy named Potiphar. And actually, scholars now think that the guy's name is not actually Potiphar. That Potiphar is a title, like Pharaoh. So, and I think, if I'm this guy, I got to be really happy. Because I'd rather have a title. I'd rather my title be Potiphar than my name be Potiphar. So, this is one for him. But Potiphar is big deal. He's the master of the guard. So, in a sense, he's like the head of the Secret Service. Or because it indicates he's the head of Pharaoh's guard. So there's either that, or he's the head of the personal bodyguards of Pharaoh, or in which case he'd be very close to Pharaoh, or he is basically the chief of staff of the army. So he's over the entire guard system of the nations, which would include the prisons. And in that case, he would be very, very close to Pharaoh. Either way, he's close to Pharaoh. The problem is that Potiphar is a workaholic. And he enjoys his job more than he enjoys staying home. Problem number two is that Potiphar's wife apparently is hot by Egyptian standards in that time frame, because the Bible even says she is extremely lovely, and that sort of thing. So it's a bad thing. This plays out like Days of Our Lives, doesn't it? So it's a bad thing that if you're a very attractive woman whose husband is never home, you can hear the striking like sands through the hour. It's kind of appropriate, like sands through the pyramids. So are the days of our life. So you have this attractive woman who is, she has desires. And here is 17, 18-year-old Joseph. God. All these J's just throw me. So you have 18-year-old Joseph, and he is in the height of masculine vigor, and it's kind of like he's there, and she sees him, and she tries to seduce him, and he says no. He is tempted, but he says no. She tries to seduce him more? He says no. She tries to seduce him more. He says no. He turns out to be a very strong young man in this situation. And I think there is some theological nugget that we can gain from here. Earlier in this chapter, it says the Lord was with Joseph. And I think it's important to remember that, the Lord is with us all. But how we recognize God's presence in our lives is the difference between whether we will give in to temptation or whether we will succumb to or whether we will overcome temptation. So the Lord was with Joseph, true, but Joseph also had a very heavy, definite reliance on God. I mean, there's no way you overcome Miss Egypt 1785 BC and her blandishments, shall we say, if you are not close to God. If you're an 18-year-old boy in prison, nonetheless, and this woman comes to you, how are you going to say no? Unless you are close to God. So he goes to do some work, and somehow or another, there's this tug of war over some clothes and whatnot, and I'm giving you the Crib Notes version, and so she takes this. She gets so mad at him. She takes this piece of clothing to her husband and accuses him of rape. Well, he certainly didn't do it. So this leads to even more enslavement for Joseph. Joseph goes from being a personal slave now to a prisoner, and he's thrown in jail. But now, if you look down to the little dots that I have at the bottom of the page, I said Joseph is a type of Christ, but there's something else. God is sovereign. This is on the first page. God is sovereign. God is in control. God has a plan that he promised back in Genesis 3:15, down through Noah, down through Abraham, down through Isaac, down through Jacob, now to Joseph. And it seems to make no sense that here's this point. Now Joseph is apparently not terribly aware of this. He did have that dream, but he's not terribly aware that all that God has in store for the nation is going to work out through him. But he's thrown in prison, and he still remains faithful. He remains faithful not only then, but prior to that, because he says, there's a question that he asks when he's tempted, how am I to do this great wickedness? Basically, I understand that I'm in the presence of God. God sees everything that I do. How am I going to do this if knowing that God sees me? I think we should all ask ourselves that every time we face temptation. How can I do this great wickedness knowing that God sees me? How disappointing that would be. But anyway, so he's now in prison. But there's a long version of this story that's going to play out. God is in control. God knows what he's doing. God is sovereign. God has a plan. He has a promise that's going to be fulfilled. We often don't see it. How often have you said to yourself, well, I didn't see God's hand working in my life as I was going through this struggle, but in the rearview mirror, looking back, I definitely can see that God was at work. Well, see, this is somehow where old Joe is right now, or young Joe is right now. He is in prison, and he's in prison for a period of time, possibly a couple of years. There's also something that I think is interesting. I know that this has happened to me, and it's probably happened to you, either at work or at school or at life or at church, that somebody has put upon you some act of wickedness. They have mistreated you, or maybe tried to do harm to you, maybe got you fired, maybe got you in trouble in your job, maybe got you suspended, maybe whatever, any kind of thing like that. What these people don't realize is that if God has a plan for your life, what they're doing, even though you can't see it at the time, what they're doing is furthering God's plan. They're helping God's plan come to pass. They may think, this is where that passage comes from, what men intended for evil, God intended for good. So you might have a plan to do some harm to somebody. And you may do some harm to them. But what you're doing is what God has intended for you to do all along, because whatever this is that is going to happen to this person is going to be a growing edge for that person. They're going to learn. They're going to be not tested. Well, yeah, tested, but they're also going to learn through this process a little bit more about themselves, a little bit more about God. God is in control. This is what we learn here. In everything, good and bad. Nothing escapes God. I don't mean to say that God causes everything that happens, good or bad, but He's certainly in control, and He plays throughout the events of history and the history of our lives to work it out. All things work together for good to those who love the Lord. It may not work out for our good in this life, right? But if we continue to love the Lord, it will work out for our good in the end. And that's one of those passages that sometimes has to keep us going. And I hear a lot of people take that passage, and it fits so well with this. They take it so completely out of context in the sense that, well, you're just going to get out of this and you're going to be better off than you ever were. That's not true. You may not get out of this right now. You may have to spend, like Joseph did, several years in prison before anything comes that is better. We may not get. I see people who live and die in poverty, and they're just people of great and deep faith. They never got out of anything in this life. They never had much in this life, but it did work together for their good in the end because they're with the Lord. But just so that we know that God's purposes for our lives go far beyond right now, far beyond the immediate moment. So the next thing that happens, Joseph is working, doing. He's an exemplary prisoner and all, and then two men of very high rank in Pharaoh's court have some problems of their own, and these guys are thrown into prison. The baker and the cupbearer. I want to say the butcher and the baker and the candlestick maker, but there wasn't three of them, just two. But now these two are very important people. In fact, you could argue that there's no more two important people in the king's life, in the Pharaoh's life, than these two. Why? Because one oversees what the king is eating, and the other, God bless him, is the taste tester for what he's eating. Yes, he's the cupbearer. He brings the food. He brings the wine and everything else, but he's the first one that gets to taste it. And so if he doesn't croak, then the king knows it's all right to eat it. So these are two really super important people, two people that are very close to the king, and they're thrown in jail. This is a tale of being in the right place at the right time. The Lord has this situation worked out. Think about this. Jacob playing favorites. Jacob making this coat of nobility. His brothers despising him anyway. Now they know he's the favorite. They hate him all the more. Then he rubs salt in the wounds by telling them these dreams that they're going to be bound down to him one day. Then they throw him into the pit. They're going to kill him, but they decide not to kill him, so they decide to sell him into slavery. So he's sold into slavery. He goes down into Egypt. He's sold to Potiphar, the chief of the guard. Then Potiphar's wife makes some passes at him. He resists. She accuses him of rape. He gets thrown into prison. Every one of those things are in God's plan. To have him in that jail at that time when the, I still want to say butcher and the baker, when the baker and the cupbearer are tossed into prison with him. That's hard to understand until you see it in real time. If I had time, maybe Sunday I'll tell you about this in Sunday school, but I don't have time to tell you tonight. But he is right there. He was interpreting dreams of all of this, and there's actually he was interpreting dreams for people in the prison, and there is actually a pseudoscience called oromancy, and it's a pseudoscience of interpreting dreams. And so he saw the guys looking so sad. He asked them, "Why are you so sad?" And they told him. They had dreams. They didn't understand the dreams. And Joseph said that I will interpret your dreams. And it's a little wordplay that's a little ironic in the Bible. Here it says, Joseph tells them that that Pharaoh will lift up your head. Now, a lot of people, that has a double entendre. It can mean that you who are weeping and sad, he will take your head in your hand and lift it up and say, "Oh, it's okay, don't cry, everything's going to be all right." But also to lift up your head means to chop your head off and hang it up on a pole. So, make sure you don't jump for joy whenever you hear somebody using the phrase in the Bible, because sometimes they have two meanings. The baker thought it was good, so the cupbearer thought it was good, but as it turns out, the butler, the cupbearer, was the one who received favor and everything, and his head was lifted up in the first sense. He was released from prison. He was restored to his place, while the baker's head was lifted up in the bad sense. It was chopped off, and his body was hung up without his head. So that was kind of a nasty circumstance there. And then he goes on to interpret the Pharaoh's dreams. And then I'm kind of cutting to the chase here. There's great famine that comes, and the famine, basically, according to the Bible, it wipes out the food source in the entire Middle East and North Africa. And so there's nowhere that has food except Egypt. And so you have Joseph's brothers. They all come down to Egypt. and because everybody knows this is the only place. Joseph here is now, by the way, I forgot something. He's lifted up to the position of the Grand Vizier of Egypt, which means he is the Prime Minister now of Egypt. Here's a guy who was a Jewish or a Hebrew sheep herder and was then a slave, then a prisoner, accused of rape. He does not have a very good resume. And now he is the Prime Minister of the primary empire in the world at that time. Now, think again about the sovereignty of God. If you are faithful to the Lord, God will lift you up out of any number of circumstances. Now, don't mishear me. It doesn't mean He's going to heal us of every sickness, or He's going to give us the dream job of our lives, or anything of the sort. But it does mean that if we are faithful to God in the lowest of times, we will find a place, we will come to a place of blessing by God. Whatever that means to us and whatever that means to God, in whatever way God wants to bless us, most of the time we will realize that. Some people are a little bit more hard-headed than others and fail to recognize how much God blesses them. And that really doesn't sit well with the Lord. But nevertheless, there's a definite cause and effect here. Faithfulness on the part of Joseph resulted in blessing on the part of God. Now, you think about this before I get to the last bit. He was faithful when he was sold into slavery. He was faithful when he was seduced. He was faithful when he was put in prison. He was faithful from that point forward. And so God raised him up. Of course, God had a purpose. But it also goes to show us that God has a purpose for our lives. So the brothers come back down. The family comes back down. This dysfunctional family that's in the line of dysfunctional families, they come down to Egypt. And you know the story. They don't quite recognize them. There's this whole bit about not recognizing him and everything. But then they finally do. They're afraid because they think, uh-oh, payback time has come. But what does he say? Lift up your heads. Another play on words. There is forgiveness, there is reconciliation, and there is something in this family that had not been there until this very moment. Unity. There was no family unity from Abraham, that's in the way, from Abraham all the way down to Jacob, and really all the way down to Joseph until that minute, when he and his brothers reconciled. So this is another lesson for the church, that there must be reconciliation in the church, unity in the church, if we are to be the people God wants us to be. Now, I don't mean unity in touchy-feely, big umbrella, you believe what you want to believe, I believe what I want to believe. There's got to be doctrinal unity, biblical unity, a unity of faith, a unity of mission, a unity of purpose, that kind of thing. All that was lacking in these people. It's not lacking now. So, of course, he provides them with food and everything. They hunker down, they stay there, and then ultimately they become such a large presence and an overwhelming presence, that's this family, that they're sort of taken into slavery. And that's where all that began. But I do want you to point out, I do want to point out something to you that before we leave, that Joseph is a type of Jesus. And this means that we can see Jesus in the life of Joseph. And he sort of presages Um, Jesus. There's a whole list of things that I gave you. We're not going to go through them. But think about it. They were both sold. Remember I told you that they were both sold for money. They both had their, they were stripped of their robes. Their robes were dipped in blood. You know, all sorts of things. They brought unity to their people. Both went to Egypt. Both were slaves. Both were falsely accused. So it's an awesome, awesome thing. Both of them offer forgiveness to people who have betrayed them. So that is a wonderful story there. And then I want to. I got 1 minute. No, I don't. But I'm gonna take it. My wife hadn't come to the door yet. So there's this passage that is often used about Rachel, his mother. Rachel is considered the mother also of modern Israel. It was something that the Sadducees and Pharisees ultimately had to condemn, that people would pray to Rachel. The Jews would actually pray to Rachel. And let me look up something in the Bible right quick. But in the book of Jeremiah, there's a reference to Rachel weeping. And over in the book of Matthew, there's a reference to Rachel weeping. In fact, in Matthew chapter 2, verse 18, a voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. This is basically a passage from Jeremiah. Rachel, considered to be the mother of the Jews, she wept in Jeremiah. Jeremiah's using that figuratively, saying Rachel was weeping because my children are gone. This was his description of the Babylonian captivity. They were taken away. Matthew quotes it right after Herod kills all the babies. You remember? The term Rachel weeping is also used whenever there is great tumult in Israel and Jews die. So it's, if you hear that in the coming days, if you listen to any Christian broadcasters or anything, you might hear this phrase, Rachel weeping. So now you'll have the tie-in. Rachel was Joseph's mother. She died giving birth to Benjamin on the way to her home in Bethlehem. The tomb of Rachel, with a tombstone that Joseph erected, is still outside of Bethlehem to this day. So, and it's venerated by Christians, Jews, and Muslims. That's why it's still there. Because all three of those groups venerate it as a holy site. If it was 2 out of the 3, any 2, take 2, pick 2, doesn't matter, it'd be gone by now. But since all 3 of them do, it's still there. So the term Rachel weeping can refer to the Jews, but also in the grander sense, bringing this home. When Rachel weeps for her children who are lost, in a very evangelical Christian sense, Rachel weeps anytime her children, because remember, we are the grafted in children of Israel. We are the new Israel. We are the new people of God. Rachel weeps anytime her children are lost, separated from God forever. So that's a good way maybe to end this. I didn't get the whole story of Joseph. I hope you got something out of what was in here tonight, what we tried to talk about. But I guess maybe the thing I want everybody to see is that the Bible is so rich that you could spend, I mean, literally, we could spend a couple of years doing this just on a Wednesday night. If we took a couple of years, we'd never hit all the important stuff in the Bible if we did that. So I hope through this process, if you don't learn much from me, which is highly possible, but if you don't learn much from me, I do hope you learn how incredibly rich and connected all the stories of the Bible. Because now, maybe this is a good thing to remember. Now when you hear, if you hear a preacher or somebody say Rachel was weeping, or you make the connection. Oh, by the way, the other thing I forgot to tell you. So even though Joseph's family came down, Jacob and all the boys came down into Egypt, and eventually they grew into a nation and were taken into slavery. Joseph, by being the prime minister of Egypt, and by being in such a powerful place, and by being such a godly person, saved not only his people, but saved the world in a sense by saving all the people of the empire who were struck by the famine and who came to Egypt. He was so good at what he did and so God-gifted that he was able to divvy out all the grain to feed all the hungry people in the empire. So another tie into Jesus. He saved his people. He saved the world in a very real sense. All right. Thank you all for coming. I'll see you Sunday.